I'm Tim Ecott, and today I'm in conversation with Christian Wolmar. He's Britain's foremost writer on railways. His latest book is called To the Edge of the World, the story of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Wolmar describes the building of the Trans-Siberian as one of, possibly the greatest human engineering achievement, and of course he has himself travelled the line. I asked him first what it was about the railway that inspired him.
Well, it's almost impossible to exaggerate what an achievement it is. And I think there's two things. I mean, there's one is the sheer engineering achievement of having built 5,750 miles of railway across Russia, of which the last 4,000 miles or so was just built in a 10-year period between the Urals and the Pacific Ocean when they decided to actually build it. An amazing achievement. I mean, just breathtaking in a country that was not very well developed, did not have much industry. So, something that you just can't admire enough.
When you say a great engineering achievement, we're talking about the 1890s when it was first properly approved by Tsar Alexander III. But as you say, 6,000 odd miles, or over 9,000 kilometres. Very inhospitable terrain, a lot of it. A lot of engineers would have said there's no way a train can go from Moscow to Vladivostok.
Absolutely. Not only inhospitable, but also crucially with very few people living there. And therefore very difficult to find the labour to build it. The materials were not always there. Oddly enough, in some places there isn't much wood, and the wood that is available is not the right sort of wood, so that had to be brought in. The ballast had to be brought in. The rails, of course, had to be brought in, and all that. And they built it in sections which were to some extent being built simultaneously. Three sections being built simultaneously with dozens of work sites. Probably an amazing organizational achievement in a country that was not well developed, did not have much industry, had no history of building anything like this apart from churches, and it built the greatest railway in the world. And the second point is the railway today, which we can come on to later. But when I was commissioned to write the book, I thought, well, this is a sort of little winding railway that goes into the middle of nowhere and was built on the whim of a Tsar, and it's not very heavily used or anything. Quite the opposite. This is the backbone of the Siberian economy and of its transport system. It's absolutely crucial.
The book is called To the Edge of the World, but I wonder if we can start at the beginning in 1891 with Tsar Alexander. You say crucial to Siberia. But what was the motivation for him? Was it money? Was it territorial security? Was it military? Why did he think it was a good idea to unite the East and the West of Russia?
Well, there were certainly several reasons underlying it. And you have to think that Siberia was a somewhat distant land. All it was used for was sending people to exile, both political prisoners.
But it was also a source of wealth, wasn't it? I mean, fur and minerals and gold to a certain extent. It was seen as somewhere where eventually money would come from, was it not?
To some extent, but the primary motivation, I don't think, ultimately was economic, but it was imperial and it was military, because Siberia was semi-detached from the rest of Russia. It's cut off by a modest mountain range. It's not considered part of Europe. It's part of Asia. So Russia wanted to ensure that its rather tenuous hold over the whole of Siberia would be established with the construction of this line. There were elements in Siberia that wanted a free Siberia, to create a country of its own, an autonomous nation of some sort. And so building the line was definitely a way of bringing Russia together.
And of course, apart from Russifying Siberia, if you like, there was also the prospect of the border with China, which presumably was a big strategic concern. The border was quite fluid. There was sort of territorial games going on, weren't there, between Russia and China about which bits of Siberia, as is, would belong to whom?
Absolutely. There was three powers involved here, because Japan was also beginning to flex its imperial muscles. And parts of Siberia had only recently been taken from China. China is very weak at the moment, so this was an opportunity for Russia to establish its hegemony over the East, and indeed with ambitions to go into China. And that was exhibited by the fact that the original part of the line, the China Eastern Railway, was actually built through Manchuria, and to establish its hold over that rather distant province of China. So it was a bit of a cheek, it was an amazing kind of thing to build a railway over somebody else's territory, but it was a way of exploiting Chinese weakness and establishing Russia as a Pacific power as well as a European one.
And to go back to the internal value of this, there was a monetary angle, wasn't there? You talk about this extraordinary man, the finance minister, Sergei Witte, a rather unusual character. He was for a time transport secretary, but then in charge of the finances for the Tsar. He saw a way of making the railway pay, didn't he?
Yes, I mean, Witte is definitely the father of the Trans-Siberian. Which is rather odd, actually, because if you think of finance ministers, generally all they're interested in is keeping a tight rein on the purse strings. But Witte saw it differently. He felt that Russia needed to industrialize. He saw the railways as the absolute crucial aspect of that, both in terms of creating industry of itself, but also as a means of transport. And he saw the Trans-Siberian as a way of establishing Russian control over this vast land, but also exploiting the resources of Siberia and as well helping the industrialization. He was very clever with money, and somehow he managed to sort the finances out, which were in somewhat of a mess. There wasn't much of a efficient tax system, and there wasn't much of a tax base. There was no middle class in Russia at the time. There was merely a few aristocrats, and then there's a huge peasantry, and they didn't pay much tax. But somehow he managed to persuade some foreign investors to put money in, and saw through this amazing scheme at a price that we'll never really know what it's cost, because the government at the time had just this single till system for its finances. So in other words, the cost of everything was just thrown into one big pot and spent out of that. So we don't really know what the cost was, but it certainly would be in the billions today.
Did the Tsar ever live to see the benefits coming in?
Well, Alexander didn't, but his son, the Tsarevich initially, who was very strongly involved in it. He actually laid the first stone in Vladivostok on the orders of his father, and he was put as the chairman of the committee for the Siberian Railway, which built the railway. That's a very clever move by Witte to involve him, and Nicholas was quite involved in the construction of it, kept an eye on things, definitely played a role in ensuring that the project was seen through. Because quite possible that such a massive project would stumble at the first major hurdle, just the money would run out, or just the ambition would be seen to be too great. And somehow it was seen through by a combination of Witte and Nicholas II.
And it could have stopped at a number of places in Russia, couldn't it? I mean, Lake Baikal was a big thing to get round, or to get a railway to, and then people would take a boat to the other side.
There was no shortage of obstacles, and certainly Lake Baikal was the biggest of them. How do you get round that? So initially they had ferries built in Britain, incidentally, and the whole train would go on the ferry, part of the locomotives, but the coaches would go would be shunted onto the ferry and taken across Lake Baikal, which of course is both the deepest lake in the world and a massive pool of water. And so that was one obstacle. The other obstacle, of course, was that east of Lake Baikal, it was difficult territory for building railways. So instead of building the Amur Railway, which was not built until 1916, which was in Russian territory, they built this railway in Chinese territory, which was a more direct route. But politically, that was to prove a real mistake and would cause endless trouble, both the line and Russia generally.
I suppose for a lot of people, the idea of the Trans-Siberian became a romantic thing, and relatively early on. It was in the 1920s 1920s. We'll come to the revolutionary period in a second, but wealthy foreigners would travel from Moscow all the way to Peking.
Right from the beginning, there was an exhibition in Paris where a luxury carriage was shown, and even a mock-up of the journey with sort of various
a moving canvas, on rollers that would go past the windows as people sat there dreaming of travelling on this train.
Absolutely, a whole series of moving canvases which last about 15 minutes actually, to make it seem like you're going through the Siberian steppe. And so right from the beginning, 1900s, it was sold as a way of getting to China for people, Westerners working or being in the diplomatic service in China, a way of getting to Japan as well. It was certainly better than the alternative, which by ship, even though in the early days, the line was pretty ramshackled, and there were lots of derailments and lots of delays, and you could only take maybe 3 or 4 trains per day in each direction and so on. But nevertheless, it was better. And there's some in my book, I cover several of the wonderful descriptions by these early travellers of the fact that it was a pretty Spartan railway. Even on the luxury coaches, it was not actually great.
But a lot of people were prepared to do it because Moscow to Peking in just 2 weeks.
Yes, absolutely. It was far better. There was a way through to Peking it did involve a boat journey by Lake Baikal and then another boat journey across the Chinese Sea. But nevertheless, it was a much better way of getting to China than anything else. It was quite heavily used right from the beginning. And of course, the other motivation was immigration, was creating a way of populating these vast Siberian steppes, and immigration was proved to be immensely popular, and people rushed to go populate the lands of Siberia.
You mentioned, we touched on already, the sheer engineering difficulties of it, but as the railway gradually progressed eastwards, whenever there was a halt or a station built, there'd also be a church and a police station. So there was very much an extension of bureaucracy across the country, wasn't there?
Yes, this was very much colonizing, in a way, the internal land of Russia, of Siberia. It was a way of establishing civilization, one could say, modernization, certainly, on these vast lands. And a lot of the money that went to the project was actually spent on extra resources, such as schools. Indeed, hospitals were built. Churches were paid for by a special fund created in the name of the Tsar. And even to this day, most of the development in Siberia is within 100 kilometers either way of the line, and you go further away than that, and there's nothing much. So the line was really is in a way Siberia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Ecott, in conversation with the author Christian Wolmar about his new book, To the Edge of the World, the story of the Trans-Siberian Railway. And we must just touch again on the Tsar's involvement. Nicholas, I'm assuming we're talking about. He had his own train, of course. I think you one anecdote, you say that when he travelled, he took 2 cows on board to provide fresh milk for his daughters.
Yes, oddly enough, he wasn't the only one to do that. There's some American magnates, railway owners, who did the same thing. It's obviously a fashionable thing to take your own cow with you. He had a sickly son as well, so he needed looking after. And it was, again, the Tsar travelling on the railway was a way of showing the people, here is the great imperial power, and showing that this was an exhibition of that power. I mean, so there was that aspect of as well. And of course, that was a mistake ultimately, because so much resource was devoted to building this line that it would have been much better if the Tsar had devoted more spending on other aspects which people would have benefited from, and maybe we would not have had the revolution of 1905, certainly, and the revolution of the successful revolution by the communists of 1917. History might have been very different, because you remember the 1905 revolution came after the Russia-Japanese War, which of course was created by the construction of the Trans-Siberian.
Skipping past the Tsar, who didn't stay around long enough to enjoy the benefits of the railway for too long. But then in the revolutionary, post that 1917 period, it became a crucial military resource for the factions feuding within Russia.
One of the most bizarre aspects of the story is that for time, the Trans-Siberian was controlled by a force of 70,000 Czech soldiers who had found themselves on the wrong side of the First World War fronts, the Eastern and Western fronts, and so therefore were seeking to return home via the long way round via Vladivostok. So they went on the Trans-Siberian, and then they got into a dispute with the communists and they took the line over, which is certainly an episode that would be worthy of quite a few adventure films. I certainly would like to make one. So they control the line, and then for a while the West thought that they could use these Czech legions as a way of fighting back against communism. So the line became a battleground. We've got the story of Admiral Kolchak, who proclaimed himself as the leader of the white anti-red revolutionaries. And of course it all collapsed and ended in disaster. But again, it demonstrates one of the terrible aspects of this story is that the line is just full of tragedies. It did result in the Russo-Japanese War, and then there was so much bloodshed over that line in the Civil War, and in the Second World War it played an absolutely vital part as well. So it's a story that is replete with tragedy, as well as being a fantastic engineering achievement.
And another anecdote of that period, again, post-First World War, there was something called the Inter-Allied Railway Agreement, which I found very interesting. To operate the Trans-Siberian and the Chinese Eastern Railway, we had the United States, Japan, Britain and France all giving astonishing amounts of money, $5 million each, to keep this railway in operation and under their supervision, rather than let it fall into the hands of the communists.
That's right, and they wanted to use that possibly as a way of attacking the communist government and pushing the white forces into victory. But they couldn't do that. The trouble is Europe and indeed the USA were all war-weary. Their soldiers would probably not have wanted to fight a war in a distant land in very difficult conditions. The resources were simply not there. So it was always a forlorn attempt to defeat communism along the Trans-Siberian. But they tried, and they did, to be fair. They maintained the railway and they kept it going. And it wasn't actually until 1920 that finally they gave up and they all went home and left the railway initially in the hands, oddly enough, of the Japanese, the third party with the Chinese and the Russians in this part of the world, and then eventually it returned to Russian hands and controlled by the communists. But it was a period of 3 or 4 years in which there was much chaos.
Of course, turning to internally how the line was used politically, Trotsky using an armoured train. He was a bit of a train spotter, you say. He kept a log of his train journeys, 65,000 odd miles he travelled by train.
Trotsky controlled the fighting in the armies, the Red Armies in the Civil War, from an armoured train, which made several incursions onto the Trans-Siberian. And it was through the armoured train and forces around it that gradually reclaimed the line from the various forces that were then in control. It's a mixture of white forces, the Czech legions, even the Japanese, although they never fought directly against the Japanese, and a variety of very bloodthirsty warlords. And but
what was interesting is one of the things is that how this was a command and control centre. He had his own printing press on there, telegraph station, radio equipment, a generator, a library, a garage and a bath, of course, troops as well, and 2 locomotives. So, it was militarily, it was a crucial utensil for him.
Yes, it was basically both a control centre. They could also make quick incursions into the countryside. They had some cars, they carried cars. It was also a propaganda exercise. Here is the communist forces in this massive train. Eventually there were 2 trains with all sorts of facilities and a radio to contact Moscow and so on. So the war was run from a train on the Trans-Siberian, which again, probably not many people know that aspect of the history of the Trans-Siberian.
Let's skip forward a little bit, if you like, to the post-Second World War period. As you said at the beginning in your book, To the Edge of the World, the story of the Trans-Siberian, economic, military, strategic, all these elements. But of course, principally, most of the people using the train were passengers. And it acquired this romantic aura. It became one of the things that people dreamt of travelling on. Did it deserve it?
Journeys were pretty rough with not many good facilities. The luxury trains that sprung up in the Tsarist era, of course, did not fit in with communist ideology, though the communist nomenclatura did have their own rather wonderfully fitted out train that Stalin had created, which actually he had two special suites that he could sleep in so that they never knew which one he was in case there was an assassination attempt, that sort of thing. But for the most part, the people travelling on it had a fairly rough time on what was a basic railway, which was actually, although they're very heavily used by passengers, very heavily used by freight as well. And that meant the tracks were pretty in a pretty bumpy state most of the time. The trains were slow and so on. But an absolute vital part of the infrastructure, which it remains today. I mean, travelling on it today, last year when I went on it, the trains were full of ordinary Russians going from one bit of Siberia to the other all the way through.
You've been on it relatively recently. As a train journey, how would you describe it?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. You have to have patience. I mean, it's not a scenic railway like those in Switzerland or wherever, although there's some wonderful bits around Lake Baikal, which are very beautiful. But it's, an epic journey through, a countryside that is so enormous that you just sit and watch the scenery going by, thinking just, how vast the planet is. And you relax, you go to the stations where the best way of getting food remains, in a lot of places, just buying things off people selling things at stations. And you talk to the people who pop on and off, and it's something where you really can chill out. I would really recommend it as a way of cutting yourself a bit off, although there is actually mobile phone coverage most of the way these days. But
is that part of it? I mean, obviously for you who are passionate about railways and rail travel, is it still one of those few examples of travelling in a modern world where a lot of people think things are too quick, too fast, that here's a journey that you take where you feel as if you're going somewhere and getting somewhere?
Absolutely. I mean, the trains go at 50, 60 miles an hour. It takes 6.5 days, even on the fastest ones, to go between Vladivostok and Moscow. And of course, when we did it, we stopped off at various places. And it's a great traditional train journey where the trains are very comfortable. In second class, you get 4 people in a carriage with bunk beds. They serve you fairly basic but quite pleasant food, and time goes slowly. And that was one of the really enjoyable parts of it. And I was also taken with the sheer scale and size of it. It's a big railway with bigger carriages than we have in the UK because what's called the loading gauge is bigger. It's all electrified. There's countless freight trains going in the opposite direction all the time. Every 5 or 10 minutes, there's another freight train whizzing by. And, you just can't fail to be impressed by the sheer scale of it. And incidentally, it ran on time the whole way through. There wasn't a train that was a minute late.
You say 6 days. Obviously, for foreigners travelling on it, it's an adventure. It's something the thing they want to do. Russians, of course, are using it as a means of transportation. It's still that vital link between the east and the west of the country to a degree, in spite of air travel. Are there any moves afoot to make it faster?
I think it would be very difficult to make it faster because its main purpose is freight, and the freight trains can't go much faster. There aren't that many domestic flights in Siberia, actually. There aren't that many airports, and most people probably don't live anywhere near any of the airports, so they have to get on the train to get to the airport anyway. The roads are not brilliant. There is allegedly a road that goes all the way through, but there's still doubts about how feasible it is all the year round. So I think it will remain the main form of transport for a long time. It won't speed up particularly. It will always be a slow and ponderous journey. But, you are covering thousands of miles. And the Russians are very used to it. They have a whole way of traveling. They get on, they put these special slippers on, they get given a special mug which they can fill up at the samovar at the end of each carriage, and they relax and start chatting, and it's a wonderful experience.
A good way to meet Russians. Did you feel it was a very Russian experience for you?
It was totally. We didn't travel on the tourist trains. I made sure we didn't. There are some more luxurious, expensive tourist trains that are run by various tour companies. I avoided them totally and went the wrong way in November. So we flew to Vladivostok and then took the train slowly back, kind of stopping at Ulan-Ude, Irkutsk, Novosibirsk, a couple of other places. And that was the way to do it. And, various Russian people wandered on and off. They didn't speak much English, but, we met one guy who was a police dog handler who, shared everybody always shares all their food with you. They love trying to talk their bit of English, and we talk our bit of Russian, and we understand the word pivo, which is beer, which is the most important, and vodka, and you have great fun.
How did that initial infrastructure hold up? Is the route substantially the same as it was back in the early
The route
20s?
has been straightened out quite a lot. So it's probably not 5,750 miles anymore. It's probably 5,700 miles. The various curves have been straightened out. A few tunnels have been built to shorten the route. There's now there was originally a route round Lake Baikal, which went right next to the lake, which was pretty difficult, and now there's the more internal route and so on. But by and large, it's the same route. In the early years, there were terrible problems, and it was really work in progress. And it wasn't until the 20s, early 30s, when Stalin saw this as a vital artery for steel and coal and all sorts of things, that the condition of the track improved, and it requires work all the time. I mean, that's the point. It requires constant maintenance, but it is done very impressively by the Russian railways today. It does run on time all the way through, and is a major piece of infrastructure that they spend a lot of money on.
And still today, you would regard it as a great train journey and a great achievement.
I think it's the greatest train journey. There's no way around that. It might not be the most scenic, but it is the greatest railway journey in the world. Anybody interested in trains, or indeed anybody interested in a bit of an adventure, seeing a part of the world, that you can't just pass through. You have to go there deliberately. You learn something about the vast scale of human achievement, the vast scale of Russia, and the importance of the railways.
Christian Wolmar, thank you very much for joining me here for In Conversation and talking about your latest book, To the Edge of the World, The Story of the Trans-Siberian Railway, published by Atlantic Books. I'm Tim Ecott.